we have to be very, very careful. What we're talking is not so much democracy, we're talking organised hypocrisy. Hard facts. Welcome to Hard Facts, the show that gets to the heart of the matter with me, John White. November is a month that will forever live in infamy when it comes to one of the most grievous crimes ever committed under the rubric of Western foreign policy. For it was in November 1991 that the breakup and destruction of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was set in train. November of that year, the Arbitration Commission of the Peace Conference on Yugoslavia, a body set up by the Council of Ministers of the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the EU, had determined that Yugoslavia was a country that was, and I quote, in the process of dissolution. 4 words taken together which constituted a blatant violation of the Yugoslav constitution. Indeed, they are words which today call to mind Rome adjudicating on the destruction of Carthage. Now, I recall the conflicts, the series of conflicts which led to the final dissolution of the Republic of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And back then we were prisoners of the Western narrative. There was no RT, there was no Sputnik International, there were no other media platforms. And the narrative that we received constantly drummed into us was Serbian atrocities, Serbian atrocities, and Serbian atrocities. And when you think of the Serbs, you can only think of one man, which is Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia. And interestingly enough, in March of this year, something you didn't really hear in the Western media, Slobodan Milosevic was completely, and I stress the word completely, exonerated of all war crimes and crimes of genocide in a 5-volume judgment on the crimes or alleged crimes of Radovan Karadzic, the leader of the Bosnian Serbs. I'm joined today by Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Marcus is an expert on Russian and Balkan affairs. Marcus, welcome to Hard Facts.
Hello, John, and thank you very much for having me on your splendid programme.
Thank you very much. Now, I stressed the issue of the Serbs because I don't think we can discuss this issue, and I'd like to start off with the demonisation of the Serbian people as a whole in the course of this conflict in the 1990s. Unparalleled, I think, in the post-war era, one people being so roundly demonised and smeared and attacked and painted as the fount of all evil in Central Europe. And this is particularly insulting when you consider that the Serbs lost more people in the struggle against the Nazis in the Second World War than any other single ethnic group. Perhaps you could start off by quantifying what the grievousness of this smear, this crime that was committed against the Serbian people in the context of the breakup of Yugoslavia.
Well, you're absolutely right. Since the Second World War, no people in the world have been demonised as much as the Serbs were demonised during the 1990s. And that demonisation of the Serbs by Western governments, by Western journalists, and by Western PR firms was all due to the fact that the Serbs in the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia wanted to keep their country, wanted to keep Yugoslavia together. And the second reason was that historically the Serbs have close ties to Russia. And the West wanted to break up Yugoslavia for a number of reasons, which I'm sure we will discuss later on in your programme. And therefore, the Serbs were the natural enemy. And the West was also aware in the early 1990s that even though Russia, following the collapse of communism in Russia and the collapse of the Soviet Union, had gone into meltdown, they understood that one day Russia could become strong again and could have influence in the Balkans via the Serbs. Enter this concerted and unrelenting campaign against the Serbs in Croatia, the Serbs in Bosnia, and let's not forget also the Serbs in 1999 regarding the Kosovo conflict. And the effects of that demonisation campaign against the Serbs can still be felt today, because in the minds of many ordinary British people, for instance, you say Serb, and they equate that to genocide. They equate that to mass murder. They equate that to mass rapes, which is absolutely despicable. And the West was able to get away with that demonisation campaign in part because there were no alternative media outlets in the 1990s like Sputnik or like Russia Today.
Interestingly. Slobodan Milosevic, give me your views on the role he played and the way he was treated and depicted in the West, and the disjunction between his real role, his real efforts to maintain Yugoslavia as a non-sectarian, multi-ethnic, multiracial state, and the way that he was depicted as a war criminal. Indeed, he was referred to as Butcher on the Balkans, a new Hitler. We've heard that one before. And isn't it really sad that he passed away in 2006 before he was able to receive his exoneration, which he received in March of this year?
Well, let's talk about Slobodan Milosevic, and let's talk about the allegations that the West made against him in the 1990s and continues to make against him today. Now, following the death of Tito in 1980, instability did start to occur in parts of Yugoslavia. However, that did not necessarily mean that the country was destined to collapse.
Sorry, Marcus, can I just interject there, because there was a socio-economic aspect to this, wasn't there? There was a context of an economic crisis. Yugoslavia, as we know, was a founding member of the non-aligned movement of states that followed an independent path from the either superpower bloc, Soviet bloc, or the Western bloc. And they did borrow heavily from Western banks to try and keep funding their high social wage, social services and so forth. And this started to become a problem. This started to unravel upon the death of Tito, didn't it?
It did. I think we have to remember something that Tito said following his break from Stalin a couple of years after the Second World War. He said that the reason why Yugoslavia took loans from the Americans was simply to ensure the independence of Yugoslavia from Stalin. And Tito said if the Americans had other ideas in mind, then they weren't going to achieve those. We have to recognise that Tito was faced with a very difficult situation, that he wanted to ensure the independence of Yugoslavia, and that even meant from Stalin. So as Tito said, he took the money as a way of ensuring that independence, but he certainly didn't allow the West to gain a foothold in Yugoslavia. We should also remember that the loans that Yugoslavia took out from the West were paid off in full in 1983. And not a lot of people know that, but in 1983, all the loans were paid off. In 1981, there were riots in Kosovo by Kosovan Albanians, and the Serb community in Kosovo, which was heavily outnumbered, were being mistreated. They were being discriminated against by the Albanian leadership in Kosovo, which was unacceptable. So, fast forward a few years, Slobodan Milosevic comes to power in Serbia. He visits Kosovo. He gives a speech on the famous Kosovo field. Now, this speech has been picked up by Western politicians and Western journalists to say that Slobodan Milosevic had it in mind at that time in the late 1980s that he was going to, quote, commit genocide against the Albanians. What Milosevic said in this speech was this: no one will ever strike or attack you again. What he meant was that the Serbs of Kosovo will not be discriminated against. He then said, and this is something the West doesn't quote, he then said, we must be a firm supporter of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Multiculturalism has always been an important part of Serbia. We must cherish that and we must protect it, and we must do everything to ensure the survival of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Now, the West doesn't quote that part. The West only quotes the first part, but they do not put it into context. They do not say that for a number of years, the Serbs had been mistreated by the Albanian leadership in Kosovo. And Milosevic stepped in to say, no longer is this going to happen. And then, of course, we go into the 1990s, and Milosevic is regarded as having kick-started the war in Croatia, as having kick-started the war in Bosnia. But the reality is that those wars in Croatia and in Bosnia came about through Western recognition of the unilaterally declared independence of Croatia and Bosnia. That kick-started the wars. Lord Peter Carrington, the former British Foreign Secretary, who was the chair of the Yugoslav Peace Conference in 91 and 92, has said that it was the actions of the Americans and the Europeans that ignited the wars in Croatia and Bosnia. Because if people understand what happened to the Serbs in Croatia and in Bosnia during the Second World War, they would understand that they were terrified of living in an independent Croatia and in an independent Bosnia.
And just to put that into its proper context, imagine what the response would be in Britain if, say, Lancashire or Yorkshire regions of the UK decided to declare unilateral independence from central government. I wonder what the response would be. I wonder if it would be met with flowers, or would it be met with bullets and guns and force? Or what about the United States? Between 1861 and 1865, the most devastating war was fought in response to the decision of 13 southern states to secede from the United States. So why do people expect the Yugoslav central government to meet an attempt to unilaterally secede from its territory in violation of its constitution with anything less than force that the governments in the West would use themselves? I want to go on to the importance, because we hear a lot about Kosovo, and I'm going to go back to Kosovo in the context of the NATO air war that was unleashed in 1999, but people don't understand the importance of Kosovo to Serbia, its historical importance. Now, it was part of Serbia's territory, as part of Serbia. Indeed, it was Serbia from the 14th century. I wonder if you could talk about that, please, for a moment.
Kosovo is the heart of Serbia. Kosovo is the heart of the Serbian national identity, and it goes back to the famous battle fought between Prince Lazar on the Kosovo field against the Ottoman army, and it was a brutal battle between both armies. Both leaders of the armies, including Prince Lazar, were killed in the battle, and there were thousands of casualties on both sides, but the Ottomans, they had more men and they eventually overcame it. However, that has gone down in Serbian history as the manifestation of Serbia fighting for its spiritual heart, as fighting for its national identity. And that is something that people in Britain, that people in America either simply do not know about, or they simply do not care about. It is so important to Serbia. It is the cradle of Serbian civilization, we can say. And so that is why there was so much concern felt by people in Serbia in the late 1990s when the Kosovo Liberation Army emerged in Kosovo. And the Kosovo Liberation Army, of course, was a terrorist organization, was an organized crime organization. Many of its leaders, including Kosovo's president today, Hashim Tashi, were serious leaders in the drug trade, in the sex trade, and in the gun trade. In fact, the American State Department, prior to 1999, listed the KLA as a terrorist organization. That was then conveniently dropped at the beginning of 1999 so that the Americans could intervene and could start bombing Serbia. But no one should ever underestimate what Kosovo means to Serbia and what Kosovo means to every Serb in this world today.
You're listening to me, John White. I'm discussing the breakup and destruction of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia between 1991 and 2001 with Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Join us after the break where we'll be continuing the discussion.
Hard Facts.
Welcome back to Hard Facts with me, John White. I've been engaged in a fascinating discussion with Marcus Papadopoulos. Now, as we do in every episode, we like to hear what the public thinks. And earlier on, Joanna took to the streets, so let's have a listen.
Yes, we went out to a rather windy Edinburgh this week to ask people, do you know why Yugoslavia broke up? So let's hear what they had to say. We're asking people today if they know why Yugoslavia broke up.
No idea, sorry.
That time was quite hard. Like, Soviet Union was broken up and they decided to split at some point because Kosovo recently separated. So that's why I think there are too many differences.
Why did it broke up?
Yes.
I don't exactly know the reason.
Honestly, I can't remember everything all about it, but I know it's to do with different religions and areas of the country.
I understand there were a lot with ethnic reasons, probably religion in it as well.
Oh, sorry, I've not heard the news this morning.
Well, what can I say? The level of ignorance on this issue, I have to say, is astounding and lamentable. Marcus, you heard the views of the public. I like to timeline this because it can come over as a very fragmented issue. Let's go back to 1991. In fact, let's go back to 1988 when a a secret meeting took place between President Trudman of Croatia, Helmut Kohl, the then Chancellor of a newly reunited Germany. And in this meeting, Chancellor Kohl had assured Trudman that if Croatia was to unilaterally declare its independence from Yugoslavia, that they would receive political, financial and military backing. And there was also an assurance given to Bosnia-Herzegovina that if it also seceded, that Germany would recognise that republic as a Muslim republic. In so doing, Germany would hope to gain the favour of the oil-producing states in the Middle East for its own economic and strategic interests. Tell me about the role of Germany in this issue, because Germans played a very egregious role, didn't they?
They certainly did. The Germans and the Croats are historic allies. It goes back to the First World War and it goes back to the Second World War. And also the Austrians and the Croats are historic allies. Germany, since the late 1960s, through its Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND, had been encouraging secessionism within Croatia and also in Slovenia. But they were never going to achieve their objectives while Tito was in charge and also while the Cold War was still going on. However, by the end of 1989, by the beginning of 1990, i.e. after the collapse of communism, the Germans saw an opportunity to achieve an extraordinary amount of leverage of power in the Balkans. The Americans unofficially told the Germans that now with the Cold War over, now with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, we, the Americans, we want to take a step back, but we want you, Germany, to run the whole of Europe on American lines. And there is a country which is standing in the way, because at that time, 1990, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was still in existence and it was still a state-run economy. So that was the opportunity for the Germans, and they started heavily interfering in Yugoslavia, and they encouraged Tudjman to declare independence. And the Germans said that if you declare independence, we and Austria will recognise that. And of course, that sparked the war in Croatia. And it was the German Foreign Minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who was the Foreign Minister at that time. And of course, he has gone down in history as the man who started the war in Croatia. Indeed, the expression is, it was Genscher's war.
I just quickly have to roll back and correct myself. I said in 1988 that Germany had been reunified. That's not the case. It didn't formally unite until 1990. The wall didn't come down until 1989, of course. But moving on. Now, the initial conflict was when Slovenia peremptorily declared independence, as did Croatia, in June of 1991. Now, they did so because of nefarious law that was passed in the US Congress, the US Foreign Operations Appropriations Law, 101 to 513. People should look this up. And pertaining to foreign aid, and in a section relating directly to Yugoslavia, it stipulated that all loans, aid and credits would be cut off within 6 months unless elections were held in each of the 6 constituent republics. Again, that's in clear violation of the Yugoslav constitution. But the most devastating provision of this legislation was that only the forces within Yugoslavia deemed democratic by Washington would now receive loans from the US. So in effect, the US was now dictating, they were actually interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign country and dictating which groups, separatist groups obviously, would receive aid. And various right-wing separatist factions benefited from this, and they were able to use this, the US largesse, to win the unilateral referenda that were set up, upon which they declared their independence. Now, there was a conflict when the Yugoslav People's Army, the JNA, attempted to intercede and to put down this attempt at secession, and this led directly to the peace conference that we discussed. And then Germany recognised Slovenia and Croatia's independence in December of 1991. In 1992, there was an attempt to set up a referendum in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but the Serb minority there opposed this, and a conflict broke out. That conflict was particularly brutal. That was the Bosnian Serbs, the minority Bosnian Serbs against Croats and the Muslim majorities in that state, or in that republic, and that ended in 1995 with the Dayton Accords. And it was in 1996 that the KLA started its activities, leading inexorably on to 1999 and NATO's air war against Serbia. I want to focus now on this NATO intervention in Serbia, because this was a seminal moment, I think, in the history of the world, especially with regard to NATO, because there was no UN authorisation for this intervention. It was at the behest of Clinton and especially Tony Blair, who was the then British Prime Minister. He really was flying the flag for military intervention on the grounds of humanitarian intervention, which led to the infamous responsibility to protect, rather. These are code words for imperialism, aren't they? This is Western imperialism by any other name. Now, this NATO air war lasted 78 days. Thousands of people were killed. Civilian targets were struck. Bridges, trains, hospitals. The Chinese embassy in Belgrade was struck. Vladimir Putin recently described this as savage. He marks this as a seminal moment in his awakening of the West's intention vis-à-vis Russia and vis-à-vis the rest of the world upon the demise of the Soviet Union. Talk me through this, Marcus. How do you recall this air war?
Yes, with terrible memories and with terrible anguish. I was on Trafalgar Square in 1999 protesting against the bombing. So the West likes to project itself as a guardian of international law. It likes to project itself as caring for the lives of civilians. The reality, of course, is very, very different. The so-called humanitarian intervention is all about gaining geostrategic objectives by the West. And many people in Britain and in America and in other countries around the world believe that this intervention, that NATO intervention, began in Iraq. Well, it didn't. It actually began in the former Yugoslavia. It began when...
in the heart of Europe, in Enlightenment Europe.
In the heart of Europe. And it didn't just begin in 1999. It began in 1994 and 1995 when NATO aircraft started bombing the Bosnian Serbs. And then, of course, we go to 1999 and we see this dreadful air campaign against Serbia, which was not endorsed by the United Nations Security Council. So it was completely illegal. And that was the foundation for what we see today, the foundation for Western intervention in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Ukraine, is what happened in the former Yugoslavia. That is the root. If you want to understand about Western intervention, NATO intervention, you must go back to the former Yugoslavia. And when the West recognized the independence of Slovenia, of Croatia and Bosnia, they destroyed the sanctity of internationally recognized borders, because the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was a founding member of the United Nations. Its borders were recognized by all other members of the United Nations. It is a grave illegal act to recognize a secessionist group on the territory of a country whose borders are internationally recognized. And if we talk about Bosnia, I mean, certainly Germany was responsible for the war in Croatia, no question about it. America was responsible for the war in Bosnia. At the beginning of 1992, the Bosnian Serb leader, Radovan Karadzic, and the Bosnian Muslim leader, Izetbegovic, they were close to signing an agreement which would prevent war. And both leaders were going to Lisbon to sign that agreement. However, Warren Zimmerman, the American ambassador in Belgrade, spoke to Izetbegovic before he took his plane journey to Lisbon. And he said to Izetbegovic, if you don't like the agreement, don't sign it. Hint, hint, i.e. the Americans, we, America, will support you. And of course, Izetbegovic did not sign that peace agreement with the Bosnian Serbs, and then the war ignited. So the Americans were responsible for the war in Bosnia. If we talk about Kosovo, then it was certainly a NATO operation, but spearheaded by America, spearheaded by Britain. And as you correctly said, Tony Blair, in my estimation, was even worse than Bill Clinton, because Tony Blair wanted a ground invasion of what was the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the next following on from Tito's Yugoslavia. So, the blood on Tony Blair's hands, on Bill Clinton's hands, go back to what happened in 1999 when the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was savagely attacked by the West.
Yeah. Now, the trigger for the NATO air war was the rejection by Slobodan Milosevic and the Serbs of the terms presented to them emanating from the Rambouillet conference in France. But when you look at those terms, they're unbelievable. I mentioned the comparison between Rome and Carthage, and it's absolutely appropriate. They wanted NATO troops to go wherever they wanted, not only in Kosovo to protect the Kosovans, but all over Serbia. They want to be able to bivouac wherever they chose, immunity from Serbian law. I mean, this was an act of aggression. This was not a serious attempt to foment peace. This was a clear attempt to affect war, because they knew that no people, no government could accept those such onerous terms in the violation of its sovereignty and its national territory. So the Nazis couldn't have done any better, could they, really, when you think about what happened to Yugoslavia?
Well, do you know the comparison I make with the ultimatum? Let's call a spade a spade. It was an ultimatum that the West gave the Serbs in 1999. The comparison I draw is what happened in 1914 when the Austrians gave an ultimatum to Serbia following the assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne in Sarajevo. The Austrian ultimatum was not a genuine way to avert an Austrian war against Serbia. It was a pretext for an Austrian war against Serbia. And as one distinguished historian referred to that ultimatum that the Austrians gave the Serbs, no self-respecting country in the world could have accepted it. Now, let's shoot forward from 1914 to 1999. As you said, that ultimatum that the West gave to the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was an ultimatum that no self-respecting country in the world could accept. No question about it. But then the ultimatum was designed in that way because the West wanted a war against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So that is how the West works, in a very conniving, in a very ruthless way, and completely and utterly devoid of all morality.
Just finally on this, Marcus, as with Iraq, which came later, as with the mess of the Middle East, as with the events that took place after 9/11, Yugoslavia's destruction would not have taken place if the Soviet Union had remained extant, would it?
Yes, I certainly believe that. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was a magnificent country. It made so much progress under Tito in health, in education, in welfare, and it was crushed by the West at a time when the Soviet Union in 1991 was on its deathbed. Had the Soviet Union not collapsed at the end of 1991, I would argue that the West would not have been able to achieve its objectives in the former Yugoslavia, because it was quite clear by the late 1980s, by 1990, that Yugoslavia was starting to get closer and closer to the Soviet Union, because the Yugoslav leadership knew that it was a new world. The Cold War had ended, and one socialist state needed the support of another socialist state. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, that meant that the West had a free hand in Yugoslavia, and they tore it to pieces. And do you know, John, all the countries which, the republics which made up the former Yugoslavia and are now independent countries, they are all worse off because of it. They are in a diabolical state today in terms economically, in terms of society. Just look at Croatia, look at Slovenia, look at Bosnia, look at Serbia. They are in a terrible, terrible state. And Tito would be turning in his grave if he knew what had become of those regions which he did so much for, and which people lived well under. People had security and stability under Tito, but today that is gone. And I think we can say that, as I said, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that meant the end of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. A tragedy, and especially a tragedy for the people of that great country.
Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you very much for joining me on Hard Facts. I just hope that people listening to this learned as much as I have. And thank you for listening. Please join us next time when we'll be discussing more Hard Facts.